Hey everyone, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 117th episode of the Writ Podcast. It's an election year in 3 provinces in Canada, and throughout the year I'd like to keep you updated on what's happening in each of those provinces. We'll start with British Columbia, which is scheduled to go to the polls on October 19th. The NDP has been in government there since 2017, but the Premier David Eby has only been there since 2022. Lots of changes happening in politics in British Columbia as there seems to be some sort of realignment on the right. So joining me now is Richard Zussman, legislative reporter for Global News in Victoria. Hi, Richard.
Hey, Eric. Thanks for having me as always.
So how is the BC government, the NDP government, preparing for the election? And a theme that, also hearing in Saskatchewan and New Brunswick, is the election actually going to be in October?
Yeah, the election will be in October. One factor is very personal. Premier David Eby is getting ready to welcome his 3rd child in June, so I don't expect we're going to have an early election. I'm not sure his wife, Dr. Kaylee Lynch, would be very appreciative of that. So I think the expectation is based on that very personal fact that baby will arrive in June, Premier will take some time off, and then hit that campaign trail and go to the polls in October. Like all provinces, there have been lots of rumors about maybe the NDP goes early. They are looking really good in the polls, but the expectation is around October. We've seen the other political parties start nominating a lot of candidates. The NDP has been slow on that. We haven't seen the sort of typical things in terms of retirements from ministers or MLAs, nominations of prominent candidates. We haven't seen any of that. So I expect we will be there in October. In terms of preparation, it seemed to me, Eric, that it's been a bit slow. We have no real sense yet of who's going to run the campaign, who will take on those prominent roles. You mentioned that this is going to be David Eby's first time going to the electorate as leader. He's going to build a team that's a little bit different than what we saw with John Horgan, although you will see a lot of familiar faces. So none of that is really shaped up yet. Yes, there are rumors about the sort of people that will be taking those senior roles, but none of that is shored up quite yet. NDP's raising a lot of money. They are attempting to gather a lot of information. Premier's obviously spending a lot of time visiting various regions of the province, but so far on the real nitty-gritty of running elections, we haven't seen that tangible stuff in front of us quite yet.
How about how the NDP is trying to position itself?
Yeah.
This is obviously David Eby, not John Horgan. Are they trying to reposition the NDP in any way, particularly when they're facing an opposition that's a lot different than when it was in the last campaign?
And that's going to be the crucial piece. They are honing in clearly on those issues that matter. One of the things that's been perplexing here in BC is when you look at the polls, they continue to indicate that British Columbians like the job that David Eby is doing. They would like to see him re-elected. But when you ask on specific issues, the electorate is saying we're not happy with what the government is doing. I've really struggled with that disconnect. That's often when you see change, is when people say we're frustrated with the way the government is dealing with affordability, dealing with housing, dealing with healthcare and public safety. But we haven't seen those two things line up quite yet. And that's the only way there could be shift here. But the Premier's focused in on those core issues, attempting to put forward legislation. We're going to have a budget in February. We already know a few big things are going to be in that budget. There's going to be a house flipping tax. That's something that's going to be hugely popular. This idea that houses in British Columbia should be used as investments is something the electorate is very irritated about. And we know for a long time people have taken advantage of our housing market here to make a lot of money. So a flipping tax would help at least send a message they're cracking down on that side of making money in the housing market. The other thing we expect to see is some sort of rebate, likely through BC Hydro, the cost of living issue. And we've heard it in all provinces and federal government around this idea of carbon tax and what's going to be done about putting money back into people's pockets. David Eby is doubling down on our carbon tax, doubling down on electrifying our grid, about reducing emissions. But he says we can do that and provide support back to British Columbians, and that likely will come in the form of a BC Hydro rebate. So that is going to be a key thing to watch, is that budget in February, and then hitting some of those core issues of saying, look, we know there are challenges here, but I am the person best suited to deal with it. And like many provinces, we have the urban-rural divide here. Premier has spent a bunch of January in rural areas of this province. And there was a fascinating article in the Prince George newspaper saying Premier David Eby is eating Kevin Falcon's lunch. Kevin Falcon, the BC United leader. That is home turf for BC United. And the fact that the local newspaper is saying an NDP premier has walked into town and said he's doing a good job at addressing the issues that matter to people outside of Metro Vancouver and outside of Victoria, that's a big win for the premier.
Does this suggest that then the NDP is like on the offense? They're expecting to pick up seats. They're not just playing defense, despite the fact they have a pretty big majority government?
So the picking up seats thing is all about the dynamic about what's going on the right. And I know we'll get to that in a minute. But to set all of that up, it's crucial to understand what we're seeing there. BC United used to be the BC Liberals. Kevin Falcon became leader. They launched a rebrand. And all of a sudden, you saw this emergence of the Conservative Party of BC through the polls. And because of all of that, we are going to see, we expect, historic levels of vote splitting. And in so many of these ridings, the NDP now believes they are in play. They are organizing in places like Kitimat, Kelowna, Kamloops, Revelstoke, even Prince George, places that it would be hard to believe that the BC NDP would be able to gain seats, especially now, as you described, they have this big majority. But all of that vote splitting is leading to the NDP believing there is room. They're making money so they can run campaigns in lots of different ridings. The base still remains Southern Vancouver Island and Metro Vancouver, but there is that goal to start going on the attack, to addressing those issues across the province and not put themselves in a shell and be defensive and say, okay, we have enough seats, we're going to just protect what we have. The sense is that they believe there is growth. And the other important thing to note, we're adding 6 ridings in BC this election cycle, so we're going from 87 to 93, so that opens up some potential doors there. If you just look on the face of it, Eric, based on the last election, 5 of those 6 seats would have been NDP seats, so that even bolsters their majority a little bit more. Obviously, the electorate changes and pressure points change, but they are for sure on the offensive here as they look towards some of those ridings. It would be hard to fathom, even in 2020, in the last election, that the NDP would have a chance in.
All right. Well, as you mentioned, it's because of those vote splits. So let's talk about what's happening on the right. What is happening on the right? Because, as we've always seen before in polls in British Columbia, the BC Conservatives can do well in a few polls, but it doesn't end up becoming anything real at the election on election night. But this time, it does seem like something's actually happening on the right.
Yeah, it feels very different. And those who follow BC politics will know that historically, if you vote federally NDP, you vote provincially NDP. If you vote federally Conservative, you vote for that center-right coalition, which historically has been the BC Liberals, Social Credit before that, now BC United. And if you vote federal Liberal, you're the one who ultimately decides who wins the election here. Well, I'm hearing from a lot of federal Liberals that say they believe this is a lost cause, that what's happening on the right is not speaking to them, and their votes are largely being parked with the NDP. That's a problem. The other problem is this emergence of the Conservatives. So BC United was led by Andrew Wilkinson in the last election. They went to a result that was historically bad, the worst they had had since their emergence in 1991, and they made a change. Kevin Falcon's a well-known person here in this province. He was finance minister under Christy Clark. He was transportation minister, health minister, and many other things under Gordon Campbell. He lost to Christy Clark in that 2011 leadership race, and then he returned. And one of the big things he heard from his members was, we want to change the name. We don't feel liberal. And Kevin Falcon has long been associated with the Conservative Party federally. And so they made this move to BC United, and all of a sudden they go into a by-election and they finish 4th. And the Conservatives finish 2nd. There is some name confusion, but the Conservatives led by John Rustad are tapping into that frustration that you see that Pierre Poilievre is also tapping into. And you see a lot of the same messaging from John Rustad around getting rid of the carbon tax, getting rid of decriminalization, having conversations around whether trans athletes should be banned in high school in British Columbia. He is speaking to a very specific demographic, and those in that place, living in more rural areas, feeling that, government has let them down, they feel frustrated by BC United, BC Liberals as well. So yes, there is some brand confusion that people don't know what BC United is, so maybe when a pollster calls, they say, I'd like to vote Conservative, but there also is that underlying sense that mainstream parties don't look out for me, and I want to try something new. The Conservatives are sort of on this verge. Are they going to sweep to a number of seats, or is it going to be a gradual breakthrough where they split, and then you end up with, BC United and BC Conservatives winning very few seats and the NDP winning a lot of seats. So that's in essence what's going on the center right and more further right part of the political spectrum.
Do the Conservatives have an organization to capitalize on this numbers we're seeing in the polls? Because BC United obviously have the organization that they had when they were the BC Liberals. So how is that going to play out?
They don't, and they don't have any money either. So we're finally seeing some fundraising numbers, and the Conservatives are not raising a lot of money. Even with these polls going up, they're struggling to raise money. And in an election year, as you know, political parties have more success raising money, especially when you're going up in the polls. But still, there are new election finance rules here in BC. We used those in the last election as well, but the political parties are still grappling with what these rules look like. There are huge limits on getting corporate and union donations. So raising a lot of money really quickly is hard. The political infrastructure for BC United is interesting. A lot of those federal Liberals who helped get them elected through the Campbell years and into 2013 are on the sideline. I have heard from so many of them, Eric, basically saying this election is a lost cause. Kevin Falcon doesn't speak to me, and I want to wait for the next iteration of what this looks like, because I'm not going to spend my political capital as an organizer in working for this party. So that's challenging for BC United. They still are raising money. They had high levels of fundraising in the last quarter of last year, so from September to December. That helps them get organized for the campaign, but they also have to spend a lot of money on a rebranding exercise, telling people who is BC United. They're spending more than $1 million on buying ads through traditional and social media to try to inform the electorate about who they are and what they stand for. And it's going to be problematic, but you raise a good point. The Conservatives just don't have the boots on the ground at this point to pull that vote. They may be able to turn some of these poll numbers into votes, but it's very hard. And it costs a lot of money to turn sentiment into an actual vote. And that is going to be the Conservatives' biggest challenge. They have 2 MLAs at this point. They can use some of their MLA budget to do some work around the province, but largely they're going to have to rely on that fundraising, and they just don't have enough of it to run a really effective campaign. It may change, but right now they just don't have enough of it to run a really effective. BC's a big province, and to travel across the province, and especially the ridings they're speaking to, right? Like, if you want to focus in on Metro Vancouver and the 40-plus ridings there, you can do it in a day on a bus, tour around Metro Vancouver, be from corner if traffic's okay, in an hour and a half. But when you're talking about going to Fort St. John, going to Dawson Creek, going to Prince George, going to Kitimat, Kamloops, Kelowna, you're talking about a lot of air travel, and that costs a lot of money to get to all those places.
Speaking of small parties, what about the Greens? They were part of that agreement with the NDP in 2017, kind of fallen back in some of the polls. How are they preparing? How are they looking ahead of the election?
Yeah, it's hard to gauge what they're up to there. There's been a real divide in the party. Andrew Weaver left, not on the best of terms. There is still a lot of animosity between himself and leader Sonia Furstenau. It's interesting because Furstenau is the only leader that ran in the 2020 election. Everybody else is going to be new. So she has that experience on the debate stage. She has experience running a campaign. But 2020 was so unique. It was a COVID election. It didn't feel like a normal election campaign in terms of having the bus and traveling across the province. We'll see how Furstenau does in that situation. The party is struggling to find its place. The NDP has consolidated a lot of those votes around the environmental movement. And yes, there are still going to be a lot of Green supporters. The Greens have been successful here in British Columbia. We have a history and a record now in this province of electing Greens at the federal level, at the provincial level, and at the municipal level. But it's still going to be an uphill battle. And where do they find their space? The one place that if you break down the ridings that they're obviously targeting, is that riding that runs from West Vancouver all the way up through Squamish, Whistler, and Pemberton. Jordan Sturdy, a longtime BC Liberal, BC United MLA, just announced this week that he is not running again. The Greens need a breakthrough outside of Vancouver Island. They were so close. They actually won that seat on election night, and then based on a recount, it went to Jordan Sturdy, the incumbent, and BC United, then BC Liberal. So that's one place the Greens are looking, but it's going to be very hard for them with the current landscape to run a province-wide campaign. They are going to tighten their focus in terms of trying to keep what they have here on the island with Sonia Furstenau and Adam Olsen, maybe expand to that one riding on the other side of the water. But it's going to be a challenging campaign for them. There's going to be a lot of noise. There's going to be a lot of noise on the right, and the NDP are going to be trying to fight the battle in Metro Vancouver, and the Greens finding space for the conversation is going to be hard for them.
All right, so the election's in October, and as you said, there's some real reasons to believe that. So in the shorter term, what are you going to be watching? What's the biggest issue you think that could impact the next election that might unfold over the next few weeks and months?
Yeah, so obviously budget is big. Election year budgets are always crucial. So I mentioned the two big things we're expecting, but it's going to be bigger than just the hydro rebate and the flipping tax. There's going to be a real blueprint here from the NDP around how they want to govern. And this is going to be the roadmap for their election platform. And yes, whoever they bring in to run the campaign will have ideas about platform. David Eby also has a lot of ideas about platform. He is a big thinker. When he designed his platform around his leadership race, a lot of those were his ideas. And he was frustrated as housing minister. He felt that a lot of the big ideas he wanted to put in place were being blocked by Premier John Horgan. There's nobody to block him anymore. He's the decision maker. He's the one that sits at the head of the cabinet table. So a lot of what we see in that budget is going to be directed by Premier David Eby and likely will be something that we see in the platform. So that's clearly going to be an important thing. Sussing out what's going on with the Conservatives and BC United in terms of candidate recruitment is going to be key. I've heard lots of stories BC United is really struggling recruiting candidates. They have been rolling out some, but they need to make a big splash, and I expect over the next few weeks we're going to start seeing some of that shake up, whether some of their current MLAs decide either to leave politics or go federally. We've already seen some of that. Watching that over the next few weeks is going to be really crucial. The one name that keeps coming up is Ellis Ross, well-known Indigenous leader, represents the riding of Skeena. Kitimat and Terrace are the big communities there. And there's a lot of talk that Pierre Poilievre really wants him to run federally. And he would be a big catch federally if he decides to make that jump. That's something I'll be watching over the next few weeks too on the BC United end. So there'll be things that shake out. Yes, these elections feel longer and longer, but they're going to be broken in chunks here. Budget, legislative session, David Eby's baby, the summer season in terms of going to fairs and festivals and meeting people, and then once we hit school back in September, that's going to be the 6-week sprint right to that October 19th election day.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun election year. Richard, appreciate you joining us to chat about it and looking forward to chatting again.
Yeah, I can't wait. Love coming on the show as always, Eric. Thanks for having me.
All right, now let's go to Saskatchewan. The Saskatchewan Party has been governing now since 2007, making it the longest-serving government currently in Canada. Scott Moe won a majority government in 2020 and is looking for re-election on October 28th. Joining me is Adam Hunter, provincial affairs reporter for the CBC in Regina. Hey, Adam.
Hey, Eric.
So, like I said, the Sask Party is preparing for an election later this year. First of all, are we sure it's going to be in October?
It's a great question, and I think it's a question I get asked pretty often. It's from all my colleagues because we're like, hey, should we prepare for an early election? We got to get our ducks in a row, but also from folks out in the public who want to know if the government's going to go early. I'd say there's a decent chance that they call an earlier election. In 2020, that's the last time there was a provincial election here. The government did kind of flirt with, and they admitted to it, calling an early election in the spring. But of course, that was scuttled by COVID and the start of the pandemic. And so they did want to go early. Brad Wall's last election was an April election. So there is a history of a spring election here, and it's always kind of gone from spring or fall, and usually it has to do with the agriculture schedule historically here, that they don't want to be really disrupting farmers during harvest or during seeding. So they kind of try and beat spring seeding and go before harvest or after. And, we have the October election date, as you mentioned, but another interesting wrinkle here in Saskatchewan, I don't think this really factors into the Saskatchewan Party's thinking, but it is a factor. Municipal elections have fixed dates, and that links up exactly with the provincial election. And that happened a couple of years ago with the last election. And so that causes a lot of kind of an overload of information for voters out there when you have lawn signs and people campaigning, and there's kind of a struggle for, to fight over the oxygen for the people in the public. How much can they take of, kind of side-by-side municipal and provincial campaigns. So if they do keep it in October, that's another thing that's going to be in play again this time around with the municipal elections happening a couple of weeks after the provincial election. But to answer your question, there's speculation here, I think, from political watchers that there could be an early election. There's a number of reasons why the government would do that. They have the NDP as a relatively new leader in Carla Beck, who's been around, for more than 18 months now. She's not new to Saskatchewan people or to her constituents in Regina Lakeview, but she's new to voters. She's been doing a lot of traveling around the province trying to sell her vision of the party and her vision of what a government of the NDP would look like. And so to try and, stem some of that momentum she may have, that could be a reason for doing it. Another reason would be the Saskatchewan United Party, who we've talked about in the past as kind of this like up and coming burgeoning party on the right who build themselves as the real conservatives or the real right for Saskatchewan. They don't have a big foothold and they aren't on the tips of anyone's tongues here in Saskatchewan, but they have money. They have pretty vibrant social media campaign. They are trying to fundraise, and they have one MLA in the legislature, Nadine Wilson, who's defected from the Saskatchewan Party when she was removed from caucus. So they have a bit of a voice. And they did very well in the Lumsden-Morris by-election in the summertime with a second place finish. Still a distant second place, but for that by-election, I know we talked about that's still a pretty impressive debut. And they've kind of sold that as, hey, we're for real, we're legit, and you should pay attention to us. And so to try and maybe stem the fight off from the right and the Saskatchewan United Party and the Buffalo Party, who finished second in a few ridings in the last election, and also from the left and the NDP, I think we could see an early election. And also, the last time the government went in the spring, they were able to maybe introduce a budget and then call an election and then vote on the budget after the election. So the government did forecast a surplus of $1 billion less than a year ago. And that's now been whittled down to a deficit of more than $200 million in less than a year. And so we were expecting, okay, you're going to have this good news budget. You're going to have all this money to spend. People are going to get all these goodies. Maybe there's a tax cut. And that doesn't look like it's going to be really super likely. There's always surprises. But, releasing a sort of a bad news budget and calling elections may be an interesting political decision. But there's also a lot of things at play. And the final thing I'll say about the spring election is we have seen, I know you've noticed this, a lot of nominations. So yeah. I know this is similar in New Brunswick as well, as there's been kind of a flood of nominations. And a lot of these happened in the late fall and early winter, and they're still going. And almost all of the incumbents for the Saskatchewan Party, and certainly the name incumbents, including some cabinet ministers, are back. There's some that still haven't declared yet their intentions. But that led to speculation that, okay, they're ready to go, or they're going to be ready to go, or even the threat of being ready is another thing. So there's still quite a few nominations to happen still, but many of them are over the next number of weeks. So, if the government were to decide we're going back in March for the spring sitting, and the budget's on March 20th, that they're deciding to go back early or, release the budget and call the election, they could still squeeze in a few more nominations, and they have lots of time for that. So
they're keeping their options open. So the Sask Party, still leading in the polls, doing pretty well, has that rural base that's going to be hard to dislodge. How about the NDP? How are they preparing for the next election?
The NDP has been really, vocal and busy in Saskatchewan right now. For people that aren't aware, we're in the midst of kind of some labor strife with teachers here. They just held a one-day strike this past week. There's more job action expected in the coming days. They haven't really announced what that's going to be. They're playing their cards close to their chest, but the teachers have been without a contract since the end of the summer. And it's been pretty pretty tough for the government and the teachers going back and forth with this lack of an agreement, and they're really a far ways from coming to an agreement by all sounds. And so the government started running taxpayer-funded billboards saying this is what teachers make, and they make more than the teacher in this province, and that was kind of pushed back on by the teachers saying all that is misinformation or it's misleading. And the teachers now have a billboard campaign going. They had 13,000-ish teachers picketing in minus 40-degree weather outside the legislature. Not 13,000 across the province, but thousands in Regina outside the legislature and all across the province in freezing temperatures and the part of the one-day strike. So that's kind of in the background of all this. Do you want to call an early election when the teachers don't have a deal and there's a lot of kind of animosity out there? That's one issue that the NDP is kind of jumped on. They had, Carla Beck and other MLAs picketing with the teachers during this one-day strike, and healthcare is like it is everywhere else in the country is a major issue. There's been disruptions, hallway medicine, ERs breaking fire code in Regina and Saskatoon, and that's something the NDP has jumped on as being a major issue, as we've heard all across the country in recent weeks and months. And the other big issue, and I know you've seen this in polling, and this is the polling we see as well, is that behind healthcare, education, number one is cost of living. And Saskatchewan's no different, and Saskatchewan gets billed as, one of the more affordable places to live, and it is. But the costs are going up here just like they are everywhere else. And the NDP is latched onto that. They've asked for the provincial government to cut the gas tax, as we've seen in other provinces, including Alberta. And the government's said they are not going to do that. And the NDP says, well, that's a bit of hypocrisy when you are campaigning really hard against the carbon tax and the federal government on almost a daily basis, yet your provincial gas tax is remaining what it is, and the government says, well, we need that money to generate funds for the province to pay for things like healthcare and education. So the NDP has been on those three topics pretty exclusively, mixed in with some social services issues. Homelessness is an issue in Saskatchewan as it is everywhere else, and specifically in the major cities. And so that's been another place where the NDP has kind of pushed the government, and especially in the cold weather, you see, the need for shelters and shelter space and addictions and mental health spaces. So that's another place where they're pushing. And I'll say that the government's been, I wouldn't say receptive to their calls is probably the wrong word, but they've been responding to it in, over Christmas, just before Christmas, giving some money to the health authority here to prop up some healthcare needs in Saskatoon and Regina, specifically, emergency room money for paramedics. And then when it comes to social services, trying to increase shelter spaces and find people a warm place during these bitterly cold months. So there have been a few things where the government is, saying, hey, we're dealing with this and we're on it. But that's, of course, not going to stop the opposition from finding places to critique.
You mentioned canceling the gas tax, healthcare being a big issue. Does the Saskatchewan NDP see Wab Kinew and the NDP in Manitoba and the roadmap they had to winning their election last year as a potential kind of path to follow for them in Saskatchewan?
It's a really good question. I asked Carla Beck that, the day after Wab Kinew won, and there wasn't sort of this adoption of, okay, yeah, we're going to do what they did. We are going to take their game plan and we're going to run with it. There's provinces of similar issues, similar demographics. So, what's going to work there is going to work here. As you mentioned, the situation there for Wab Kinew coming into a government there that was unpopular, was not polling well. They didn't have a leader who's been established for a few years, replacing another premier. Those sorts of issues where, the NDP in Manitoba could capitalize on some of the same, topics we're talking about that are issues in Saskatchewan. They have more of a mountain to climb, and they know that. So I think, the answer from the NDP was and would be, the things that work there will work here. We're not going to be able to do a carbon copy of their campaign. Having said that, as you know, and following a lot of these elections and knowing a lot of the players, Manitoba NDP supporters and NDP staffers and people that work on campaigns will be in Saskatchewan. That's a guarantee. Those people go to Alberta to work on the campaign there. They go to BC. They go across the country, and so there will be that sort of ground game, I think, effect that they could use in Saskatchewan specifically. Some of the things that work in Winnipeg will work in Saskatoon or Regina. They just will. But the issue that the NDP in Saskatchewan have that isn't maybe the same, and you'll know, you're the expert on this, but the rural mountain in Saskatchewan and the number of seats in rural Saskatchewan that just are already non-starters for the NDP it's just, they have such a, there's almost like one hand tied behind their back when they try to build their brand and get out there, because there's a lot of places where they just they have no chance of winning. So, and they know that, but they're trying to, I think, build themselves as a party that's not just going to represent the city. So as I mentioned, Carla Beck's doing a lot of traveling around. She's been all over the province in many different communities, but realistically, can they win a rural seat? You have the numbers. I don't make predictions, but I'd say the ones that they're looking for, that if you're going to quote unquote call rural, are the northern seats. And they've traditionally held those. Where the NDP, I think, and many political watchers and experts, political scientists have told me, is they need to make these inroads in Prince Albert, in Moose Jaw, the kind of smaller to medium-sized cities where there is an urban population, and some of these issues like healthcare, like homelessness, like addictions, cost of living, education, those are all big issues in those centers. And those are places where the NDP has had MLAs in the recent past. So that's where they have to make breakthroughs, but still they're behind in the polls in those places even. So those are two places where cities in particular, where they can maybe look to make gains. And I know in the past, in the last election, I think they thought that they could win a couple of those seats, and they underestimated, or may overestimated, I should say, their chances. But maybe this time around they'll have another swing at it. And I think 4 years, a lot of time has passed. A lot of things have changed here, and they maybe have they have more optimism, I think, about their chances in those places. And to be honest, to be a opposition that's taken seriously, they need to win those seats. They just have to.
Yeah, the math is tough without any of those seats. What about what issue is the thing to watch over the next little while? As we mentioned, there's the elections planned for October, could be earlier. And maybe we'll get a chance to speak in the next little while. But in the next few weeks, next couple of months, what's the thing that you're going to be really watching in terms of having an impact on the election, whenever it is?
Yeah, I think I won't go into it in too much detail because we already talked about it. But the teacher strike is one, and there's not a strike right now. It should be clear, but there is a job action. We could see, what the impacts of that, we don't know yet, and what the public's perception of that over time will be. Right now, there seems to be a lot of support for the teachers' cause. I'm saying that just anecdotally, but that, could change depending on what the teachers decide to do and how they handle this and how the province handles it. That'd be the first one. That's in the direct near term. The other thing I think that's just interesting to kind of track and follow is what happens in Ottawa is always used in Saskatchewan. And I know this happens in other provinces. It's not unique to Saskatchewan, but Saskatchewan, in my experience covering it here, it seems to be a lightning rod for anything that the Trudeau government announces. There almost always is a response, no matter what it is, from the province, and sometimes a non-response. So if there's federal funding coming for a certain innocuous or not headline grabbing program, the provincial government may not always acknowledge that, oh, hey, we got this money from the federal government, just because of the back and forth and the kind of bad blood that is there between the Sask Party government and Scott Moe and the Trudeau government. It was interesting just the other day, there was Minister Champagne was having a fireside chat the Chamber of Commerce put on beside two ministers of cabinet ministers from Saskatchewan, and it was very cordial. And they were joking about, texting one another. And this isn't the typical, bluster we see, on CBC News Network or Power and Politics when we bring up Saskatchewan. When Saskatchewan's brought up, and it's usually Scott Moe taking shots, as he did recently, about power and power consumption and the plan to go to net zero by 2035, and the provincial government here is saying, well, we're going to get there by 2050, and we're keeping our coal plants fired up. So that kind of rhetoric, and that's continuing to happen, and we've seen that out of Alberta and Daniel Smith, and I think that's something that the Scott Moe, they've been doing that since he was premier, even before he was premier, actually, as environment minister. So this is something I think that you continue to kind of watch. And interestingly, and I don't, your viewers and listeners may not be aware, but Pierre Poilievre made kind of a keynote speech at the Saskatchewan Party's recent convention just a couple of months ago. And that's pretty rare. The Saskatchewan Party has always been like, oh, we're not a conservative party. We're a party of everyone. We have a big tent. And to have the leader of the Conservative Party be the keynote speaker, it's never happened before. And I think that's a sign that, hey, we're aligned. You know, everyone kind of realizes that, goes without saying. But to kind of piggyback on that and to say, okay, this is the leader that we see as potentially being the next prime minister, or, you know, at least having the popularity right now, or the being aligned on many different issues, we're going to, you know, tie our cart to this horse. And so I think that's something I'll be watching for. You know, there's a lot of alignment there. Obviously, a lot of Sask Party MLAs are Conservative Party card-carrying members, including the Premier. And so it's not like a hidden secret, but the Saskatchewan Party was created out of a coalition of Liberals and Conservatives back in the day. And that kind of Liberal side of the Saskatchewan Party is, you know, been well documented to be kind of dying off. So very much a Conservative Party in name, and not in name, but in policy and in kind of their beliefs. And so just seeing how that kind of plays out in the next couple of months, and how the federal, you know, the federal situation continues with the agreement with the NDP, how it's constantly brought up here, and it's constantly brought up in the legislature, probably more than people would expect. And I don't expect that to change.
Yeah, keep an eye on Regina and Ottawa, I guess, for the next few months. All right, so it's an election year. It's always exciting, and I appreciate you coming on, and hopefully we'll chat again soon. Thanks a lot, Adam.
Thanks, Eric. I appreciate the chance, and we'll love chatting with you.
All right, now let's get to New Brunswick. The election is scheduled for October 21st. The PCs have been in power there since 2018, and Blaine Higgs got a majority government in 2020. There was talk of an early election last fall, potentially an early election this year. We'll see. So joining me to discuss it is Jacques Poitras. He's the provincial affairs reporter for the CBC in Fredericton. Hi, Jacques.
Hello, Eric.
So like I said, there could be an early election. They had the bus ready last time. So how are the PCs preparing? And it does seem like they're doing it rather publicly.
Well, there was a lot of preparing in the fall behind the scenes. This month in January, they're doing a bunch of nominations. So by the end of January, they'll have 11 candidates nominated, which is quite a sudden spurt. They nominated their first candidate in December, and they're doing 10 this month. So all of a sudden, they're filling up their slate. There's 49 ridings, so that will get them a big chunk of their candidates nominated. And these are all, with the exception of the one in December, these are all incumbent PCMLAs who have declared their intention to run again. So no big surprises or drama in these nominations, but it is a sign that they're picking up the pace. And if there were an election call, say, after the budget is introduced and voted on in March, like let's say in April, you can imagine at this pace that they'd have well more than half of their candidates, in place by the time of the budget. So it does feel like they're keeping that option open.
How are the PCs kind of doing right now? Because the last time we chatted, it was all about splits within the caucus. There does still seem to be some divisions, in part based on who is kind of being nominated to be candidates.
There's still an uneasiness in the party, to put it mildly. I mean, we had a letter from a longtime Conservative member in Moncton, Francophone member, to the entire caucus a couple of weeks ago, complaining about the direction of the party, the socially conservative direction of the party that he sees, and the sort of populist right-wing bent that Higgs is taking. In December, they nominated Fétine Grzeski, who's a well-known in Christian conservative circles. She's a huge star, really, a well-known broadcaster and activist, and she's been nominated as their first candidate. And a lot of people in the party are leery of this direction of sort of straying away from the traditional, moderate approach of this party. So that's where things are at. There hasn't been a lot of public dissent from the caucus, but I don't think that whole dynamic that we saw last year with the split has been resolved. We still don't know The Premier still isn't saying whether he would sign the nominations of 5 PC MLAs who broke ranks with him on this school LGBTQ pronouns issue that came up. There was a couple of ministers resigned, a couple were shuffled out. Whether they want to run again or not, they haven't said exactly. Whether he would sign their nominations if they won a nomination, he hasn't said. So there's a bit of almost a standoff there, and that'll have to be resolved at some point as we get closer to an election.
The last year has been a little difficult for Blaine Higgs. The approval ratings he has aren't particularly high. Do you still get the sense that they're confident or that they're weary of an election?
I think they see a path, and I think there is a path for them to win. They have 29 seats right now out of 49. That's kind of near what most people think is their ceiling. And so it's really going to be a defensive election in terms of holding what they have, and they can't afford to lose too many because they need 25 for a majority. But the math works in their favor. You and I have talked many times about the vote efficiency of the PCs compared to the vote inefficiency of the Liberals. And so it's conceivable that they can, even with a lower popular vote result in an election like we saw in 2018, that they could emerge with the most seats. But they really don't want to go below 25 because the Greens, the third party in New Brunswick, has already indicated that they would not support or prop up a PC government that was a minority after an election. So it's shaky. Healthcare. There's been ER issues here. Homelessness and housing have become huge issues in the last couple of years. Very difficult, very controversial, not easy to fix. A lot of people impatient for like a healthcare solution, which is always easier said than done. So if those issues become the center of a campaign, it's a challenge for them, but not inconceivable that they can squeak out 25, 26, 27 seats.
All right. So you mentioned the Liberals. It sounds like they have a much wider path in the sense that they don't necessarily have to win more seats than the PCs in order to get a shot at governing. How are they preparing for the upcoming election?
Well, they've only got 4 candidates nominated so far, but they are gearing up. They're trying to attract well-known names. They have some well-known names that they're recruiting. They're, in the last narrative research poll, ahead of the PCs by 6 points. But again, that 6-point gap is what the Liberals had in 2018, and they came out of that election with 1 fewer seat than the PCs. So that vote inefficiency is the big challenge for them. The path for them is to squeak out some wins in Moncton in particular, and then to some extent, maybe a lesser extent, in St. John and Fredericton, the 3 cities where the PCs have some incumbents who could be vulnerable. If, for example, voters are turned off by this social conservative shift in the party, the Liberals could pick up there. And yeah, I mean, even if the PCs were brought down to like 23 out of 49, you can imagine a Liberal-Green understanding coming out of that. So the Liberals don't really have to get to 25. Of course, they want to, but if they can pick away and take out enough PC incumbents to deprive the government of 25, it'll get interesting.
Do you get any sense that the Liberals feel the brand is an issue? Obviously, Justin Trudeau, not super popular right now, even in Atlantic Canada.
Well, Susan Holt, the Liberal leader, had a very, I would say, awkward, interesting, almost entertaining scrum before Christmas, where she was trying to talk about whether she agreed with Justin Trudeau on certain issues. The Conservatives have blamed Trudeau policies for all this homelessness crisis by pointing to a left woke agenda on issues like drug legalization and so on that has contributed to all these problems. And so Holt was asked, do you think Justin Trudeau is too left? And she actually said yes, and then really got into this kind of verbal pretzel trying to explain whether she was more to the center than he was and where she was progressive and relative to him. And so it is a bit of a conundrum for them dealing with that liberal baggage federally. You know, we saw Blaine Higgs out this week raising money in BC and Alberta. Out-of-province donations are allowed to New Brunswick parties under provincial elections legislation. So we saw him kind of drumming up support from like-minded conservatives in the West who like what he's doing. It's hard to imagine the Liberals having much of a fundraising opportunity nationally, given where the federal party is these days. You know, it's hard to imagine Susan Holt showing up in like Winnipeg or something and saying, support the Liberal brand.
Yeah, Western Canada also probably not the best place for a Liberal to go raise some money. How about we talk about some of the other parties? So you mentioned the Greens. How are they going to look at the next election? Because the boundary changes, there's going to be a new electoral map. It is going to seemingly cause some problems for David Kuhn, the leader.
Yeah, that's right. They have 3 incumbents. 2 of them are seen as pretty solid in their ridings, even with new configurations. In fact, some would say that the new configurations are more favorable to the other 2 Green incumbent MLAs. David Kuhn, his current riding is Fredericton South. It's a downtown urban riding. Very solid for him. It's been split in 2, carved out into 2 ridings with larger areas outside the downtown. And it's not necessarily a foregone conclusion that the new riding he's running in is great for him. It includes part of the downtown, but not all of it. But his name recognition and popularity and profile are huge. I mean, really out of proportion to the party's standings in a way. So that leader effect, as you've talked about many times, can help a party in a riding. And Susan Holt, incidentally, is in the other New Fredericton riding, and that riding, if you look at past results, would not be great for the Liberals, but she's also banking on that leader factor to help her. So the Greens, are in a good position to win 2 or 3, to hold all 3. But then the question is, can they grow? And so they are really beating the bushes for good, solid candidates, brand name candidates, people well known in their communities, which still counts for a lot in New Brunswick elections. And they are particularly interested in, I think, southern New Brunswick, thinking that if they can start to break through in places like St. John and Moncton, then other parts of the province will take them seriously and see them as a contender to really up their seats. But it's not a foregone conclusion. There was some feeling that they would go from 3 to 4 or 5 in the last election, and they basically were stuck at 3. So that remains to be seen. And of course, if they start to come up but not enough to win seats, then that raises the issue of vote splits with the Liberals and creates a whole other dynamic relative to the PCs holding on to ridings.
Speaking of vote splits, the NDP usually polling in the high single digits, low double digits, despite the fact that the last election they got less than 2% of the vote. You have the People's Alliance, which more or less folded itself into the PCs and then started up again as a new party. Are either of these going to have any role in the election?
It's hard to see. The NDP went through a bunch of turmoil with different leaders and interim leaders. They have a leader now, Alex White, who is a permanent, seemingly solid leader, but they are, a lot of the oxygen on the left is taken up by the Green Party, and a lot of former New Democrats, NDP voters, vote for the Green Party now because it articulates a lot of the same issues, a lot of the same progressive takes on whatever comes before the legislature. I was looking at political financing filings this week from the parties, and like the NDP's bank account is virtually non-existent. There's just nothing there. So it's a challenge for them. People's Alliance, I was looking at their filings as well. They only have registered riding associations currently in like 8 to 10 ridings, as I recall. So they also, after their 2 remaining MLAs joined the PCs a couple of years ago, they have really struggled to be relevant, to be factors in some by-elections that have been held. So, they'll be in the race, but it is really a 3-party dynamic, I would say, heading into the next election.
All right, so the election is scheduled in October. There's rumors it could be earlier. But over the next little while, the next few weeks, next couple of months, what do you think is an issue that's worth keeping an eye on that could have an impact on the vote whenever it takes place?
Well, healthcare for sure. There has been sort of some incremental progress since the Premier made these sweeping changes to the healthcare system. He shuffled his minister, fired health authority CEO, purged the boards of the 2 provincial health authorities in July 2022. And they've sort of come up with a number of new models of trying to get more people primary care faster, to take pressure off emergency rooms. And it seemed like there was incremental progress happening to some extent, but in the last few weeks we've seen huge ambulance offload delays at hospitals, huge staffing crunches in the Fredericton Emergency Department and others. So that is sort of right back top of mind to where it was before. Like I said, homelessness and housing, cost of living continue to be issues. And then what will those sort of moderate PC members do? And will they vote for an acceptable Liberal candidate? Will they stay home with the party sort of going in this socially conservative direction? How far will the party go? How much will the Premier and the campaign team emphasize those issues? Because there's really a difference of opinion whether it's a vote winner to sort of rile up a base or add to their base, or a vote loser with kind of more moderate voters. It remains to be seen what effect that will have, but what effect will it have? The Premier's doing his annual State of the Province speech next week, so that'll be kind of a signal of what his message is going to be going into the rest of the year. And then the legislature resumes in March with a provincial budget, which would be their chance to sort of put some things in the window to voters. But Higgs has said many times that he doesn't do election year budgets, that there won't be a radical change of direction or, a flood of new spending to sort of attract any new votes. So those are the signposts coming in the coming weeks. And then once we get to that March budget, what indication do we have that he might go early?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest question for the next few months, I think, in New Brunswick. Jacques, thanks so much. We're looking forward to chatting to you again later on this year.
All right. Happy to do it.